Coming up in this tutorial, we discuss camera motion, depth of field, 3D layers, keyframe assistant, and then keyframe expressions. We get a result that looks something like this. Hey, Nathan here, and welcome back to another After Effects tutorial. I apologize in advance. I'm suffering from a stuffy nose, so if my voice is a little off, I apologize for that. So in this tutorial, I want to discuss some very basic things. I want to discuss 3D space using 2D layers and objects like text or an image and how to use that in a 3D space. And then I want to discuss the camera and specifically how to position and move about the 3D space. I will not go into the details about the camera. There's a lot of options you can use, especially when you first create the camera. But I'm just going to choose a very basic one, and then I'll discuss the 3D space and then the camera motion. Okay, let's create a new composition, and I'm going to choose 960 by 540 so I can look at it at 100% and so we can still work on it. And I'm going to call this camera and 3D. Okay, so first thing we should see is the black screen here. Now if we go to layer, new, camera, and I'm going to choose, let's say, a 35 millimeter. And then you can adjust the film size, the zoom level, the angle of view, the focal length, and then the lock to zoom. Use millimeters, or you can use pixels, inches, whatever you want, and then measure film size horizontal, vertically, or diagonally. I'm not going to go into all these options in this tutorial, but I'm just going to choose a 35 millimeter and then go with that. I'm going to call it camera 1. I'm just going to leave it that way, and then I'm going to click OK. So now we should have a camera. If a dialog pops up saying a camera cannot be applied to a 2D object, just click OK, and then it's just saying to be influenced by the camera, 2D layers need to be 3D, and then I'll go into that in just a few minutes. Okay, so the camera allows us to, zoom in, zoom out, move the camera to a new object in 3D space. But what's really important and really works in a lot of special effects is the depth of field, and then I'll discuss that briefly in this tutorial as well. Okay, so let's go up here and let's create a text, and let's just call it front text. It doesn't matter where we position it. If you want to position it in the center, you can bring up the title action safe and then get it positioned up in the center. Okay, so that is the front text. Let's select that layer. Let's go to Edit, Duplicate. And now let's modify that text by going back to the text tool, selecting front text 2. Let's click in the little box here. Hold down Control and A to select all the characters, and let's say back text. Now we want this to be the same size text, same leading, same if we center it, same every attribute of the front text. We want it to be the same as the back text. The only difference is we're going to push this in 3D space to a specific location. So right now these are 2D layers. I'm going to modify both layers, front text and back text, to be 3D. To do that, depending on your modes here, click this little toggle switches / modes button until you see what looks like a little 3D cube. Once you see that, check that box in both layers. Now they are both 3D layers. Now let's select both the text layers by selecting one of the text layers, holding down Control and selecting another one. Let's press the letter P to bring up the position. Just click the camera so you can deselect it. Now let's only select the back text. Then let's push that back in Z space by clicking on the last digit here. It's X, Y, Z. Click and hold, and then you can move left and right. Push it forward or push it back. Moving to the right pushes it back. Moving it to the left brings it forward. Holding down Shift as you do this makes it much faster. So I'm going to move it back. Let's say right about there. Now let's go back to the camera and let's have a look at that. So we have our front text, and then you see we have our back text. Below the composition here, we should have several options. To the right of the checkbox, chess or checkers, that type of board game, that to the right of that we should have a camera drop down where we can select what view we want to view the composition at. I'm going to choose a custom view, and then I can go up and manipulate the view of this so we can actually see what the camera sees, where it is, and where our objects are. So I went to custom view 1, and if we go to the top left here, where we have our tools, you should see a little camera icon. So if we click and hold, I'm going to use a unified camera tool for this. Now if I hold down the left mouse button and move my mouse around, that changes the angle that we're looking at. If we hold down our right mouse button and move around, it changes our positioning. Go forward, we move our mouse up, we're going forward. We move our mouse down, we're going back. So I'm going to move back, and I'm going to look at our scene. So we have our front text here, and then our back text here. Now, what's really cool here is if we click our camera, we can see what the camera is going to produce. This line here going to the center of the letter T. That is the point of interest. And then what you see, the little rectangular box here, that is what we see in the composition, in the actual active camera view. So, to discuss this further, what I'm going to do is I want to move the camera in 3D space from the front text to the back text. So if I click the camera, press the letter P, it gives us the position. We can modify it, the X, the Y, and then the Z. However, as you noticed, some things are a little wacky. If we go forward, just past the front text, look at what the camera does. That is because our point of interest influences how the camera moves. So just as you saw before, when I was moving the x-axis, it was moving around. It was still looking at that text. The camera is fixed on that point of interest. So if we want to adjust the camera to move from the front text to the back text, we need to change the point of interest. And we can change it by pointing to the back text. Now if we do any sort of movements, that is what it will be focusing on. Okay, so now that we changed the point of interest, let's actually go look at that for a minute. So that looks just about perfect. You know, you can bring it back or bring it forward a little bit. But that looks good. So now let's go back to the camera 1. Okay, so let's set up the motion first. So it's going to stay here, let's say for 1 second. I'm going to set a keyframe to the position here. Then I want it to transition for, let's say, another second. And I want to transition it to the back text. So it's going to transition to the back text. So that is our camera movement. Now, to make that a smooth transition, let's go a little bit before that keyframe. Let's press the letter B. Let's go a little bit after the second keyframe. Let's press the letter N. And then we can do a RAM preview of just that segment, just that motion. So that's a pretty not interesting animation. There are several things you can do to change this. I'm going to do the basic way. If you select both keyframes by holding down your mouse and selecting them by creating, a box around them and selecting them both so they both look yellow, so they're selected, and then right click any one of them, go to keyframe assistant, and then easy ease. That will smooth the transition. It'll slowly go forward, get up to speed, and then slowly stop. The advanced way, if you look at this icon right here, you can look at the curve for the motion. So that's what the easy ease does. It slowly goes up to speed and then slowly comes to a stop. But I'm just going to keep this tutorial simple with the easy ease keyframe. You can go in here and modify it if you want to. Okay, so the motion is now done, what we want the basic motion to be. We have 2 text objects in 3D space. One is pushed back in the Z-axis, and the camera is going from text number 1 to text number 2. Now, let's discuss the depth of field. So if we go into the camera options, we have a depth of field. It is currently set to off. If we turn it on, you might have noticed that, but if you didn't, let me go ahead and increase the aperture. Look at the back text here. As I increase the aperture, keep on looking at that back text. So the camera blurs out anything that is not within the focus distance. If we decrease or increase the focus distance, things get blurred out or blurred back in. So we can look at the back text and then the front text will be blurred out, or we can look at the front text, and then the back text will be blurred out. So that is a cool thing to do when you have special effects, is to use the depth of field, and then you can blur it, change the blur amount. You can actually go above 100%. I'm going to keep it at 100%. Okay, so when we go from front text to back text, the focus should be correct depending on the position of the camera. As you see, as we go from front text, that's being blurred out. At this point, it's being blurred out because the distance is not met. The text is right in front of the camera, but our focus distance is a lot farther. So it's being blurred out as we transition from front to back. So I'm going to actually adjust the position of the second keyframe. In order to do that, let's bring up the transition keyframe and position the transition properties here. Then we get the keyframes, and then I'm going to click this little right arrow to select the second keyframe. I'm going to adjust the Z until the back text looks about 100% correct, not blurred. That looks about good. So now let's go ahead and preview this. Everything looks fine. Now that's a pretty boring transition. It stays here, nothing's moving, and then it just goes to the next one and then stays there. So what I want to do is I want to shake the camera every second, even during the transition. So I'm going to briefly, very quickly discuss keyframe equations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up to, wiggle the camera. And we're going to use the wiggle command to do that. We're going to use the orientation from the transform property list. We're going to just wiggle the orientation. So instead of left clicking the stopwatch here, let's hold down the Alt key and then let's left click. That will bring up the expressions. And then we can set up an equation here to do what we want. So I'm going to set up a wiggle command, and that accepts, the way I'm going to use it is it's going to take two parameters. Once a second, it's going to change the orientation by 1 degree. Alright, so now let's RAM preview that. So it's not so boring anymore because the camera is always moving. Now if we want to speed it up, we can say 10 times a second. It'll change it by 1 degree. Now if we do the opposite, if we leave it the same speed as the first example, but a much larger degree per second, it's going to be a slow movement, but a much larger transition based on the degrees. So you're not shaking the camera, you're slowly moving it, but it's a much larger degree. 10 versus what we had before, which is 1. Now if we set it up at every second, it's going to modify the degrees by 40. That's even much larger. But it's not shaking so crazy as if we did 40 by 1. So this is 40 times a second. The degrees will change by 1. So that's going to be much larger shake. Or, I'm sorry, much faster shake, but a smaller distance. So that is the wiggle command. I'm going to change it back to 1 and let's say 3 degrees. Alright, so I think that pretty much does it for this tutorial. I wanted to discuss all this because the next tutorial I want to discuss Element 3D from Video Copilot. That's why I had this webpage up. So I want to discuss the Element 3D plugin from Video Copilot, and you have to pay to get this plugin. And then I want to discuss how to create a simple text extrusion and how to create your website logo and do something cool using the camera and positioning in 3D space and moving your camera. And maybe do this wiggle command as well. So I wanted to do this in this tutorial because I wanted to keep the other tutorial dedicated to Element 3D. And then, we'll just throw in the camera, and what we learn from this tutorial we will use in the next tutorial. So this is a pretty basic tutorial, but I think you get the idea of, 3D space and the depth of field and how to, use keyframe expressions, keyframe equations, how to use the Easy Ease keyframe assistant. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope my voice wasn't too horrible with a stuffy nose. Stay tuned for the next tutorial where we will discuss Element 3D. Thanks for watching. Enjoy.